There is a strange quiet at the heart of every pursuit, a stillness that sits beneath the pulse of movement, where money becomes less a matter of numbers and more a story of endurance. In this film, that quiet is everywhere, inside the grays of its cities, within the half-lit rooms of its wanderer, along the trembling lines of those who chase him. The making of such a journey was not simply a production built on schedules and budgets. It was an act of holding one's breath through the turbulence of creation itself. To live through its making meant living through a kind of financial weather, shifting winds of approval, trust, tension, and the slow, deliberate dance of coordination that holds a film upright when the story itself is in perpetual motion. At its core, the film's money journey began as a continuation of something already proven yet uncertain in its repetition. The earlier success lingered like a shadow. It offered safety, but also an invisible demand. Those who returned to the table could sense the silent pressure, to match what worked before without making it feel like a copy, to expand a world without breaking its realism. That tension bled into how money moved. It didn't pour out in bold gestures. It circled cautiously, like footsteps around a familiar trap. Each step into pre-production carried both memory and risk, and every financial decision became a balance between momentum and fear of overreach. In meetings and mood boards, the team likely spoke less about what to spend and more about how to maintain tone. The restraint of the first story had defined its identity, and now that restraint itself needed financing. There is a unique irony in funding minimalism. Resources must be deployed to sustain the illusion of scarcity. Each location, each chase, each handheld shot had to feel raw, not rich, though behind the camera there stood an entire machinery of cost, control, and coordination. The money, in this sense, existed to make itself invisible, to let the audience feel danger and displacement without ever sensing the comfort of a large production watching over it. As the journey moved forward, what appeared on screen began reflecting what surrounded it. The restless geography of the film, its passing through cities, borders, and languages, mirrored the restless travel of the production's own finances. There were permissions to secure, crews to transport, currencies to reconcile. Each border crossing became both a narrative and logistical act. When the camera darted through a crowded street or lingered over a gray skyline, there was a hidden echo of wire transfers and approvals that had traveled their own routes. The energy of the chase was mirrored by the energy of keeping the film solvent and on time. Those working closest to the project felt this dual motion, the creative sprint inside the administrative marathon. Assistants, accountants, and coordinators learned to breathe in rhythms that matched the edits. When a director wanted an extra take in fading light, someone else was recalculating overtime in the dark. When a scene demanded a shattered car, another mind was quietly tallying what that destruction meant in replacement costs. Yet no one voiced these details aloud. They moved like a current beneath the emotional tide of production. To belong to a film like this was to live in constant motion while trying to preserve composure, an emotional economy mirroring the financial one. In this ecosystem, money didn't merely purchase things. It shaped the texture of time. It decided how long a thought could linger, how many angles could be explored before moving on. Every extended pause, every silent stare on screen, was permitted by the resources that allowed such patience. Conversely, every abrupt cut and raw fragment of the film carried within it the tension of a clock running out. There is something profound in realizing that emotion itself can be budgeted, that urgency is not only felt by characters but by those who build them. Throughout the shoot, the emotional and sensory texture of money was omnipresent. It was there in the sound of a generator before dawn, in the movement of crew trucks through narrow streets, in the fatigue of repetition that only those on set can fully recognize. The money was the pulse that kept this rhythm going. It was not glamorous, but it was constant. The team's shared experience of exhaustion became a kind of communion, binding creative impulse with fiscal discipline. In moments of fatigue, when scenes refused to cooperate or weather turned hostile, the cost of persistence felt physical, carried in the body like a muscle strain no one had time to rest. What made this particular journey distinct was its merging of interior and exterior pressures. The protagonist's life of displacement found reflection in the production's own transient existence. Crews uprooted themselves, moving through new environments that offered beauty and complication in equal measure. Some days felt abundant, others stripped bare, yet through it all ran the same quiet principle. Keep going, keep balanced. The line between emotional intensity and financial strain blurred, and by the end of each shooting day, those two forces felt indistinguishable. Even in post-production, the rhythm persisted. Editing became an act of economic rhythm as much as creative pacing. Every hour in the suite carried a cost. Every choice to hold or trim a shot had invisible ripples. There is a strange intimacy in editing within limits. The mind learns to feel where restraint is not merely aesthetic but necessary. Out of those limitations often arises precision. What the eye calls focus is sometimes just the shape of what could not be afforded to wander. That quiet discipline became part of the film's identity. Lean, immediate, and deliberate. Behind the scenes, the film's money journey likely carried a deep sense of responsibility. There was legacy to protect, trust to justify, and a tone of seriousness to maintain. No one here could afford excess. Not in performance, not in production. The discipline became collective. Actors and crew alike moved as though aware that any misstep echoed through a chain of costs. This awareness did not dull creativity. Rather, it concentrated it. It brought a kind of purity, the knowledge that every moment must count. The film's efficiency became its art form. What surrounded the production, however, was not simply order but anticipation. Expectations from outside hovered like weather fronts, pressures of comparison, commercial projections, public hopes. Money flowed in invisible patterns shaped by this expectation, tightening or relaxing as confidence shifted. There were nights of reassurance when everything seemed aligned, and others where the uncertainty of reception weighed heavy. Within these swings, the people making the film learned to live in ambiguity. Faith one day, doubt the next. The economy of feeling mirrored the economy of production. In the end, the financial path of the film was less a straight line and more a circle of trust repeatedly tested. Each department became its own microcosm of accountability. Costume managing texture and wear, props guarding continuity, camera balancing beauty against practicality. Every dollar's purpose could be seen, if one looked closely, in the frame's density, the tight choreography of focus and movement. Money became a language understood intuitively, spoken through gestures rather than words. When the shoot finally closed, what remained was not exhaustion but a quiet reckoning. The film had transformed the abstract flow of funds into something tangible. Emotion, motion, memory. The participants could look back and see where the weight of cost had pressed into the shape of the story. How certain scenes held more gravity because they had required more of everyone, not only in craft but in patience. The money journey had imprinted itself invisibly, leaving behind a discipline that outlived the production itself. After release, when balance sheets settled and returns began to whisper their verdicts, the people who had lived this story likely felt a muted pride. They knew what the audience could not see, the hundreds of small financial negotiations that kept the film alive, the quiet heroism of stability under strain. In their private reflections, they could trace the unseen arcs. From early uncertainty to measured confidence, from tension to endurance. The film's success, whatever form it took, was not merely commercial. It was existential. It had survived its own creation. To look back on that experience is to see how money, art, and emotion interlace into one continuous current. The money is never just a tool. It becomes the bloodstream of a vision, invisible yet vital. In this film's making, that current ran steady, powering moments of chaos and calm alike. Every fleeting expression on screen carried within it the labor of a coordinated world behind the lens. A world where patience equaled cost, where decision equaled consequence, and where faith was measured not in returns but in completion. The lived feeling of that path endures in the film's atmosphere. It is why each frame feels earned, why each silence resonates with invisible effort. Those who were part of it remember the logistics as much as the scenes, the paperwork as much as the performances, because both shaped what the world eventually saw. Money in cinema often disappears behind glamour, but here it became the silent architecture of authenticity. It held the narrative in place, gave shape to motion, and offered the illusion of spontaneity through the discipline of planning. When everything was over, the accounting, the press, the public conversation, what lingered for those inside was not the sum of earnings but the memory of motion itself, the continuous negotiation between need and possibility. The film lived because a network of people believed that control and chaos could coexist, that precision could coexist with emotion. They turned that belief into schedule, structure, and shot, one after another, until what once felt fragile became inevitable. And so, beneath the surface of action and intrigue, the true story was one of endurance. The endurance of trust, timing, and shared restraint. The film's money journey was not about excess but about the discipline of purpose, the act of holding still while everything around demanded acceleration. In that balance lay its quiet triumph, a creation that moved the world by staying grounded in its own careful rhythm, built on invisible foundations of patience, coordination, and unwavering faith in the craft's unspoken economy. The sense of scale in a film like this is deceptive. What unfolds on screen feels raw and immediate, as if someone simply followed a restless figure through the streets of Europe with a camera and no plan. But behind that illusion of speed lies a carefully measured structure, a scale that reveals itself not through spectacle but through precision. The production aimed for breadth without grandeur, intimacy without limitation, and it achieved that by building an ecosystem of control, where every element, from light to movement, existed within an exact financial boundary, invisible but absolute. At the center of that structure was a kind of quiet arithmetic between ambition and restraint. The story demanded mobility, not architecture. Tension, not ornament. The budget scale reflected this need for motion. What mattered most wasn't the size of any single set or sequence, but the ability to move fluidly from one place to another, to keep the film alive in a constant rhythm of relocation. The production felt like a caravan disguised as a spy story. Camera trucks, translators, permits, and local crews forming a moving constellation that glowed briefly in each city before vanishing to the next. This rhythm of transience shaped not only logistics but mood. The crew lived with the sensation of impermanence. A scene rehearsed in the morning could be wrapped by sunset, its location packed, its traces gone. Each department learned to think modularly. Props were light, wardrobe travel-ready, sound adaptable. Even the editing team, working in parallel, developed systems that could absorb footage from multiple countries without pause. The budget had been designed around this motion. Its strength wasn't in lavish allocation but in elasticity. Yet within that elasticity, there existed constant tension. The atmosphere on set was one of steady discipline, not extravagance. Time became the truest currency. The director, actors, and crew shared an understanding that every additional setup carried a cost. Every new angle demanded hours of work from dozens of people whose travel, meals, and hours had been pre-negotiated with precision. The weight of that awareness gave the film its focused energy. Each shot had to earn its right to exist. The restraint seen in the final cut, the clipped dialogue, the purposeful movement, was born not just from aesthetic choice but from the quiet awareness of limits. Those who lived through that production often described a sense of contained urgency. They weren't racing against catastrophe, but they could feel the thin line that separated control from overreach. The budget had been calibrated to capture authenticity, and that meant living dangerously close to unpredictability. Weather, light, and location access could shift the day's balance in an instant. There was no safety net large enough to absorb chaos, only a well-rehearsed agility that allowed everyone to bend without breaking. That agility defined the film's scale more than any sum could. Large crews may have passed through cities, but they moved like ghosts, careful not to disturb the environments they captured. When they filmed in crowded public spaces, they leaned into the natural flow of life rather than reconstructing it. This required an unusual coordination between production and place, a trust that reality itself would provide texture richer than any built set. The cost of that trust was unpredictability, and yet the reward was a sense of immediacy that no controlled environment could deliver. Inside this constant movement, morale became a kind of currency too. The people holding cameras, securing permissions, lighting narrow hallways, or managing the movement of vehicles across unfamiliar streets shared a collective fatigue that evolved into discipline. They learned to work inside unpredictability, to find focus amid exhaustion. What kept them aligned wasn't comfort or stability but a shared belief in the film's tone, its grounded tension, its refusal to decorate itself. That belief turned constraint into cohesion. From a distance, the production may have appeared mid-scale, yet to those inside it, every day felt immense. The repetition of resets, the rhythm of packing and unpacking, the precision required to keep continuity intact across continents, it all carried the gravity of a large undertaking condensed into the frame of a small one. The crew became a kind of mobile organism, sustained by coordination rather than size. That coordination was financed with quiet exactness. Nothing wasted, nothing unused. The director's eye guided the scale from within. He seemed to treat the camera not as a grand observer but as a participant, forcing every department to think in smaller, more immediate terms. Instead of designing sets that would overwhelm, they focused on textures that would breathe, scratched surfaces, flickering lights, cluttered apartments. Each detail was affordable in isolation but meaningful in combination. This philosophy of cumulative realism allowed the film to stretch its resources without appearing stretched. In many ways, the production's financial scale mirrored its emotional one. Both dealt in containment, the art of keeping intensity within borders. The actors worked in tight frames, their performances measured, precise, internal. The camera mirrored that economy, moving quickly but never erratically. Such discipline was not merely stylistic, it was logistical. Limited time on each location meant that scenes had to carry emotional clarity without needing retakes. The budget had forced everyone to become efficient storytellers. The coordination between time and space gave rise to what one might call controlled chaos. Scenes that look spontaneous, the crashing vehicles, the fast escapes, the street confrontations, were in truth orchestrated within delicate timing grids. Each moving part represented an hour accounted for, a cost balanced, a person trusted. The illusion of chaos was sustained by the calm precision of planning. The crew operated like a field unit, alert, responsive, efficient, never indulgent. Behind that efficiency, the mood of the set remained strangely calm. There was fatigue, yes, but also an unspoken pride in how little was wasted. The scale of the project seemed to teach humility. When people looked around between takes, they saw not luxury but focus. No grand trailers, no ornamental excess, only the machinery of work. That environment forged unity. Everyone knew that endurance, not expenditure, would define success. In that atmosphere, even weather became part of the design. The natural grays and muted tones of European cities were not resisted but embraced, saving resources that might otherwise have gone into artificial lighting or reconstruction. The aesthetic of realism became an ally to the budget. Overcast skies became emotional texture. Narrow streets became ready-made sets. The world itself provided production value, and the filmmakers knew how to capture it. This ability to turn environment into asset is the quiet signature of the film's scale. The production's ambition was never about building worlds from scratch. It was about extracting emotion from what already existed. That philosophy shaped how crews worked, how time was managed, and how every expense found its justification. It also created an emotional texture that audiences could feel, an authenticity born from adaptation, not accumulation. Within production meetings, the conversations likely revolved around sequencing rather than expansion. The question was rarely, what can we add? But what can we do better with what's here? That distinction carried through every department. Costume design focused on lived-in fabrics rather than elaborate wardrobes. Set dressing emphasized functionality over flourish. The camera department obsessed over mobility, how to stay light, ready, fast. This approach turned the film into a study of rhythm. The rhythm of a chase, the rhythm of survival, and the rhythm of a production constantly negotiating between freedom and control. The early creative choices made in pre-production, casting, visual tone, editing tempo, quietly defined the financial boundaries long before cameras rolled. The decision to pursue realism meant fewer controlled environments and more on-location shoots, which brought flexibility in some areas but demanded precision in others. Every choice reverberated through the schedule. When the director chose natural light, the crew gained authenticity but lost time. When the production opted for real traffic, they gained texture but risked unpredictability. These decisions, made early and quietly, became the architecture of cost later. For the crew, these trade-offs weren't abstract, they were lived experiences. A delay in a public location could mean an entire department waiting in silence, each minute registered somewhere unseen. Yet within that waiting, a strange peace existed. People knew that this was how the film breathed, in pauses, in recalculations, in the calm before the next burst of movement. The discipline required to hold that patience was itself a kind of artistry. Morale, inevitably, fluctuated. There were days when the exhaustion felt too heavy, when moving the unit across another border seemed impossible. But the tone of the film itself, its focus on persistence, isolation, and tension, fed the endurance of those making it. They found reflection in the story they served. That identification gave meaning to the grind. Even when fatigue threatened to dull creativity, the collective sense of purpose reignited it. By the time the production reached its later stages, the scale had revealed its balance. It wasn't grand in the traditional sense, but it felt vast because of what it sustained. A continuous, coherent intensity across shifting terrain. The people who carried it from one country to the next understood that the true magnitude of their work lay in coordination, not size. They had managed to create a film that looked expansive while living within the boundaries of prudence. As post-production began, that same logic of measured intensity carried over. Editors, sound designers, and colorists worked within a clear frame of time and resources. There was no luxury of endless experimentation. Choices were deliberate, born of necessity. The restraint shaped the film's final tone, a rhythm of cuts that felt urgent yet natural, reflecting both artistic instinct and production discipline. Looking back, the budget scale appears less as a number and more as a philosophy. It taught everyone involved that precision could replace abundance, and that careful coordination could create the illusion of boundless reach. The film's enduring energy comes from this paradox. It feels massive, yet it was built through minimalism. Its motion across countries, languages, and moods feels effortless because each step was measured, timed, contained. For those who lived through its making, that containment was its own reward. It demanded collaboration that erased ego. It proved that scale is not about how much one can spend, but about how much coherence one can maintain when every decision has consequence. Within that coherence lies the heartbeat of production, the steady rhythm that allows art to emerge from structure. And so, the film's scale remains one of quiet strength. It stood between extravagance and austerity, finding equilibrium in movement. Its budget wasn't an anchor but a compass, guiding each department toward unity. That unity, born from awareness of limits, sustained by collective focus, became the invisible frame within which everything else existed. To those who built it, the memory of that discipline endures far longer than the exhaustion it caused, a reminder that scale, at its truest, is not measured in magnitude but in harmony. The rhythm of financing for a film like this moved quietly, beneath the surface of what most would notice, guided less by spectacle and more by steady belief. The process was never about sudden abundance. It was about trust unfolding in careful layers. Those who supported it early did so not because they saw certainty, but because they felt continuity, a sense that the world this story had begun could live again, differently, deeper, without losing its grounded pulse. The early days of financial alignment were filled with that particular mix of optimism and restraint that defines second chances. Too much caution would stall it, too much confidence would distort it. From the beginning, timing was everything. The project's pulse didn't quicken all at once. It built momentum through stages, each new commitment arriving as a sign of confidence that the foundation was holding. The early faith belonged to those who had seen what restraint could yield. They remembered the first journey's quiet success and knew that expanding it required not louder gestures, but more intricate precision. The first waves of support likely arrived as soft nods rather than proclamations, verbal commitments that signaled intent before papers ever caught up. There's an intimacy in that phase of filmmaking, a shared recognition among those who understand that stories like this are sustained not by spectacle but by tone, and tone needs patience more than money. As these early threads wove together, there must have been stretches of waiting, the kind that tests conviction without ever quite breaking it. Financing rarely flows as a single stream. It trickles, halts, and resumes, each delay prompting quiet recalibration. In those intervals, creative planning becomes both shield and anchor. Departments sketch possibilities, rework schedules, imagine alternate paths, all while knowing that every scenario will eventually meet the rhythm of funding. The uncertainty doesn't stop the planning. It defines it. The team learns to work in conditional tenses, when, if, soon, until those words become muscle memory. The mid-stage of this journey brought a subtle shift. What had begun as cautious faith began to gather measurable traction. Commitments that were once tentative hardened into timelines. That transformation carries its own tension. Once numbers solidify, imagination narrows, and what was once fluid becomes bound to expectation. The people guiding the money's flow had to balance creative freedom against fiscal choreography. Every promise carried weight, every signature became both permission and pressure. The moment support became tangible, the project also became accountable. To schedules, to delivery, to the invisible clock that began ticking the instant funds moved from promise to presence. That clock changed the air around the production. The rhythm of communication tightened, reports grew more frequent, and trust had to evolve into performance. But within that structure, something human persisted. Those managing the financial heartbeat learned to sense timing not as numbers on a calendar but as a living rhythm. The hum of preparation, the silence before a green light, the quickened pace as teams mobilized. When payments landed, they didn't just clear accounts. They cleared space in people's minds. You could feel energy surge, rooms fill again with certainty. The late arrivals to the project, those who waited to see proof of stability before joining, brought a different kind of energy. Their confidence was pragmatic, shaped by observation rather than faith. They stepped into a project already moving, and their involvement changed its temperature. Late-stage financing often carries the dual edge of relief and scrutiny. It steadies the ship but tightens oversight. The creative team felt both. With the final pieces secured, the film's pulse steadied, but the weight of expectation grew heavier. It is one thing to create under uncertainty. It is another to deliver under surveillance. Throughout production, cash timing became its own choreography. Crew wages, location holds, travel logistics, all operated within a rhythm dictated by release schedules of funds. The production managers lived in perpetual calculation, matching creative demands to availability, ensuring that momentum never fractured. To the untrained eye, the set seemed alive with spontaneity, but every day's survival depended on those unseen transactions aligning exactly when they needed to. When a delay occurred, it wasn't chaos but pause, a deep breath until the next current arrived. Each department internalized this rhythm of restraint. Costume design avoided stylization, anchoring characters in muted realism. Set decorators leaned toward authenticity, finding existing interiors that felt truthful. Even the camera department adjusted its expectations, carrying smaller rigs, traveling lighter, learning to steal shots from reality rather than choreograph them. The creative scope was never about size. It was about precision. To aim small and hit deeply required more discipline than aiming large and missing the center. This philosophy filtered into every layer of the production. The director's framing choices reflected the budget's quiet logic. Close, intimate, purposeful. Scenes rarely opened wide unless meaning demanded it. The editing rhythm, fast but never chaotic, mirrored the production's pace. Lean, direct, always aware of time. In that rhythm lay the soul of the film, a convergence of creativity and economy where one could no longer tell where artistry ended and practicality began. There were moments, though, when ambition pressed against its boundaries. Certain sequences demanded scale, movement through cities, collisions of vehicles, tension unfolding in motion. The team found ways to stretch their reach without tearing it. Instead of amplifying spectacle, they intensified experience. They discovered that shaking a camera could evoke the same adrenaline as collapsing a building, that the human face could carry more gravity than any explosion. In that discovery lay the project's emotional economy, spending less to feel more. Every production day existed as a negotiation between scope and constraint. The crew learned to see limitation not as hindrance but as framework. When they couldn't build, they found. When they couldn't afford, they improvised. This adaptability became a form of authorship. Each compromise carried creativity within it. The lack of control over certain environments forced spontaneous decisions, shifts in angle, timing, or tone, that gave the film its sense of authenticity. The audience would later call it realism. The crew knew it as survival. The tone of the film, the restless urgency that defined its identity, was born from these pressures. Every scene carried the hum of coordination, the awareness that perfection was impossible but truth was not. The more the team leaned into imperfection, the more the story breathed. The limits of time and money shaped emotion directly. Fast takes produced genuine energy, limited retakes preserved instinct. The film became a mirror of its making, a study in controlled imperfection that felt alive precisely because it could not afford to stand still. For the director, each day was a test of patience and purpose. The budget was not a cage but a compass. It pointed toward efficiency, not extravagance. When faced with options, the choice was always for what deepened emotion rather than widened view. There was a deep kind of wisdom in that discipline. A smaller radius forced sharper focus. The result was not a film that felt constrained, but one that felt taut, every line, every motion charged with intention. The crew absorbed this ethos. Lighting teams adapted to natural sources, saving hours of setup by embracing imperfection. Sound designers leaned into ambient noise, using the living hum of the world as part of the score. Editors later found that this natural texture gave the film an internal rhythm impossible to fake. What could have been compromise became signature. What could have been shortage became coherence. The boundary between financial restraint and creative decision blurred until they were indistinguishable. As filming continued, that equilibrium became second nature. The production's daily life was marked by endurance rather than abundance. There was no room for waste. Each delay rippled outward, each success bought a little time back. Yet the mood remained focused, not anxious. The crew knew the rhythm of their own limits and worked within it like a musician staying in key. The small victories, a perfect take before sunset, a day finished on schedule, carried outsized joy. Those moments reminded everyone that mastery under constraint was a higher art than comfort under plenty. When the production moved into post, the same budget logic held. Editing was brisk, deliberate, guided by intuition honed during the shoot. Every second of footage had been hard-earned, so each cut carried respect. The team discovered that scarcity bred clarity. There were no endless variations, no aimless experimentation. Only the pursuit of what felt right. Sound, color, and pacing were refined with the same focus. The financial limit had turned into an aesthetic principle. Keep what matters, lose what distracts. The creative scope, by the end, had revealed its real shape, not a boundary but a balance. What the film attempted at its most ambitious was to sustain emotion under discipline, to make pressure visible without letting it overwhelm. The financial restraint had become the film's heartbeat, guiding not just what could be made but how it should feel. The choices that seemed forced by circumstance turned out to be the very ones that gave it endurance. Looking back, the participants could sense that every compromise had been an act of authorship. They had learned to navigate without map or margin, trusting the rhythm of instinct more than abundance. The film's tone, urgent, tense, human, was the natural outcome of its economic reality. It felt real because it was built under real conditions, limited light, finite time, and the unwavering demand to make each moment count. That was the quiet triumph of the budget logic behind it. In a world where money often inflates art, This production proved that clarity thrives under pressure. Every department learned the same truth in its own way, that to be forced into precision is to find purpose. The film's creative scope never needed expansion, it needed alignment. Within its limits, it discovered exactness. Within its restraint, it found voice. And when it finally reached the screen, the audience could feel it, the weight of choices made, the effort hidden beneath simplicity. The pacing, the tension, the tactile realism, all were born from the lived experience of constraint. What appeared effortless was anything but. It was the outcome of countless small negotiations between ambition and patience, between dream and practicality. These pauses carried emotional weight. Waiting for the next release of funds meant more than waiting for paper. It meant holding faith in the continuity of motion. People adapted, filling stillness with smaller preparations, testing lenses, scouting alternatives, refining scripts, anything to keep energy alive. The most disciplined productions are built not on abundance but on momentum, and momentum can survive scarcity if trust endures. The crew learned that rhythm intimately. As the production matured, timing became ritual. There were known intervals when relief would arrive, a familiar message, a cleared approval, a nod that meant progress. That rhythm created a sense of collective breath. Inhale during uncertainty, exhale when confirmation landed. Over time, that cycle shaped behavior. Everyone knew when to push, when to pause, when to wait without panic. In those intervals, the project's emotional core deepened. The people inside it stopped thinking of money as fuel and began to feel it as time. Time granted or denied, expanded or compressed. Late in the process, as post-production approached, timing once again redefined itself. The urgency of shooting gave way to the endurance of finishing. Cash flow now served patience rather than motion. Payments were smaller, more deliberate, tied to measured milestones. Editing progress, sound design, delivery windows. The rhythm slowed, and with it came a kind of melancholy. The people who had lived in adrenaline now found themselves in quieter rooms, surrounded by screens instead of streets. The energy changed, but the dependency on timing remained. The smallest delay in one stage rippled outward. Schedules were redrawn not through choice but necessity. What sustained everyone was memory, the knowledge of how far they had already carried this project on the balance of faith and precision. Each stage of financing had come with its own test. Early belief, mid-level confirmation, late accountability. Now came endurance. When a film neared completion, it wasn't only about finishing. It was about waiting through the final clearances, the last adjustments, the slow, patient release of what had once felt urgent. For those closest to the numbers, there was a quiet pride in how cleanly the rhythm had held. There were no dramatic rescues, no collapses. Only the steady pulse of work meeting obligation. The lived feeling was one of exhaustion laced with gratitude. Gratitude for every timely approval, every week without crisis. Money had moved through the film like a current that never flooded but never stopped, a calm persistence that carried everyone to the end. Looking back, the memory of that rhythm eclipsed the memory of the sums themselves. The people who gave shape to this film could recall exact days when tension lifted, when waiting ended, when possibility became motion. These were the emotional landmarks of financing, more vivid than any contract. A late-night call confirming continuation, a morning when the day's shoot went forward after doubt, a silent nod from someone who had fought unseen battles to make sure checks cleared before dawn. That sequence of small triumphs defined the production's inner life. Money had never been the story. Its timing had been. The entire project existed within the spaces between confirmation and delay, between hope and proof. The miracle of completion wasn't in magnitude, but in consistency. Support had arrived not as windfalls but as rhythms, reliable enough to trust, unpredictable enough to keep everyone awake. Even after the work ended, that sense of rhythm lingered. The people who had lived it found themselves listening for it long after. The pattern of arrival, the relief of resolution, the breath between phases. Financing had taught them something beyond money. It had taught them patience calibrated to purpose. They had learned that confidence doesn't always begin with abundance. Sometimes it begins with endurance, with people choosing to keep moving even when certainty walks a few steps behind. In the quiet afterward, when the film's images were locked and its music settled into final form, the early believers could see their faith reflected back at them. The patience that had carried the project through its financial tides had imprinted itself on the story's very tone. The film breathed in the same rhythm it had been funded in, cautious, urgent, deliberate. The pacing on screen was not coincidence. It was the emotional echo of how the project had survived. Every pause in dialogue, every breath before motion, felt like the mirror of those unseen pauses when money had not yet arrived but hope had not yet left. In that reflection lies the quiet beauty of the film's financing journey. It was not a tale of opulence or rescue but of steady persistence. The people behind it learned to live inside time as if it were a currency, to spend patience carefully, to save composure, to invest belief where it mattered most. The world may measure success by what appears on the screen, but those who built it know the deeper truth. That beneath every frame lies a heartbeat made of timing, trust, and the refusal to stop moving even when the next signal of support has not yet come. The ambition behind the film began as a balance between vision and realism, a pursuit of momentum that refused to rely on spectacle. What the team wanted to achieve was clarity, the kind that made every frame pulse with purpose while still feeling grounded in the limits of its own reach. From the beginning, the creative scope was shaped not by what could be imagined, but by what could be built and sustained. Every choice, lighting, framing, sound, was an act of financial consciousness, an acknowledgement that the story's strength would come not from expansion but from control. The budget became the quiet sculptor of tone, carving excess away until only the essential remained. Ambition, though restrained, still had weight. The team wanted movement that felt visceral, geography that felt lived, emotion that came from muscle rather than exposition. The challenge lay in making scale feel internal. Instead of vast landscapes or elaborate sequences, the world unfolded through confined rooms, corridors, train stations, city streets, places that already existed, dense with texture and cost-free authenticity. These environments gave the film its realism, but they also enforced discipline. To film in real places meant bending to their limits. Sound restrictions, changing light, unpredictable crowds. Every shot was a compromise turned into art. That act of turning necessity into expression became the film's defining financial logic. The first and most crucial trade-off arrived early, the choice between aesthetic perfection and emotional urgency. The creative team understood that this story did not need polished symmetry. It needed immediacy. The decision to favor handheld movement, natural light, and raw sound saved time and resources while deepening immersion. Instead of constructing cinematic beauty, they captured human tension. The money that might have gone into elaborate builds was spent instead on access, mobility, permission, the ability to move fast and light through real spaces. That redirection of resources shaped the film's look long before editing began. In the end, the production's greatest achievement was its integrity. It held true to itself, neither shrinking from its limits nor pretending they didn't exist. The money shaped it, yes, but the art transcended that shaping by embracing it fully. The balance between vision and viability became indistinguishable from the story itself. A narrative of pursuit and endurance, told by people who lived that pursuit in the making. The film's creative scope stands as proof that discipline, when held with conviction, does not diminish imagination. It refines it into something unforgettable. Awareness of a film often begins before a single image is seen, forming in the faint murmurs of conversation and expectation that ripple through the culture surrounding it. For this one, recognition carried both promise and pressure. The earlier story had left its mark, quiet but deep, and its continuation emerged into a world already listening. The first glimpses of the new project were never framed as announcements of grandeur. They arrived as restrained signals, deliberate in tone, measured in reach. This was not a campaign that shouted, it whispered with purpose. Those closest to its presentation understood that identity mattered more than spectacle. The marketing path was designed not to sell fantasy but to reawaken memory. The audience needed to feel that they were returning to a familiar rhythm, one defined by movement, precision, and unease. Awareness was built on mood rather than magnitude. The earliest imagery, tight frames, muted colors, an anxious sense of pursuit, didn't expand the world so much as narrow it, focusing attention on intensity rather than scale. The decision to maintain restraint in communication mirrored the restraint in production. The spend-to-reach ratio wasn't driven by volume. It was driven by tone. Behind the scenes, there was constant calibration. The people managing awareness had to translate the film's internal quiet into something legible for the public without betraying its soul. Every piece of material released carried the same challenge: how to create anticipation without exposure. Each frame chosen for publicity had to evoke mystery rather than revelation, tension rather than clarity. This approach required patience, because it depended on accumulation rather than burst. Curiosity, not saturation, was the intended currency. The early awareness phase relied heavily on what could be felt rather than described. The audience didn't need a list of features, they needed to sense continuity, to know that what they had once admired was returning with purpose. That feeling became the compass for all communication. Even the pacing of information releases was deliberate, designed to echo the rhythm of the story itself. When the first images surfaced, they didn't explain, they provoked. The goal was not to inform, but to awaken. Inside the production, the effect of these early signals was tangible. Crew members could feel the slow build of attention, the faint shift in how their work was perceived. For a long time, they had lived in isolation, immersed in detail with little thought of the world outside. Now, as awareness grew, they began to sense the connection forming, the invisible thread that would soon tie their private labor to public perception. That shift carried a mix of pride and apprehension. Pride, because the world was watching again. Apprehension, because expectation was rising. As chatter began to build, the atmosphere around the project changed subtly. People in offices and editing rooms could feel the heat increasing, not as scrutiny but as hum. Each interview, each mention, added a layer of validation. The production had been born out of confidence contained. Now that confidence began to stretch outward. It wasn't boastful. It was calm, assured. Even those responsible for promotion seemed to understand that overselling would break the illusion. The film's power lay in its tone, and tone, once disturbed, cannot be restored. The marketing path leaned on patience and precision, mirroring the discipline of the film itself. Instead of building an identity through slogans or excess, it allowed word and image to travel on their own rhythm. Every decision about timing, when to release material, when to withhold it, became a reflection of how the film moved. The approach trusted the intelligence of the audience, an unusual confidence in a world often obsessed with immediate validation. Awareness was treated like suspense, something to be built gradually, to crest at exactly the right moment. Within those who managed this process, confidence shifted with each small sign of resonance. Early feedback from the few who saw previews or images provided reassurance that restraint was working. The tone was landing as intended. Focused, modern, visceral. That alignment between internal and external vision became its own success. It is rare for marketing and storytelling to speak the same language. Here they did. The financial spend followed this alignment. Not large, but precise. Each dollar carried intent, placed where emotion rather than exposure could multiply its effect. As release approached, the anticipation began to hum with tension. The people involved could sense the dual pull of excitement and caution. The chatter was growing, but the world's attention is a fickle thing. Those responsible for outreach monitored the rhythm carefully, adjusting as needed, ensuring that the film's identity wasn't swallowed by comparison or fatigue. Every decision had weight. When to show faces, when to reveal action, when to let silence speak. The awareness campaign had become its own narrative, a quiet parallel to the story it served. For the cast and crew, these final days before release carried an almost surreal calm. They had lived the journey of creation in intensity. Now they lived the waiting in stillness. They watched from afar as the world began to anticipate what they had already lived. Each trailer, each article, was like a distant echo of their work, reframed for others. The spend that fueled these echoes was invisible to them, but they could feel its presence in the shift of atmosphere around them. When people in the streets or online began to talk again, the film felt real in a new way, not as process but as event. What made this stage remarkable was its restraint. The reach expanded, yes, but it never betrayed its tone. The marketing didn't try to simplify the film into spectacle. It respected its gravity. That respect drew the right audience, the ones who preferred tension over noise, precision over explosion. The alignment between message and movie created trust. Even those who had no direct hand in marketing could feel that something had been done correctly. The world's perception matched the film's intention. As the first screenings approached, the chatter condensed into expectation. Awareness had done its work, but quietly, as if carried on the wind rather than broadcast from towers. The sense of anticipation was focused, not frenzied. Those inside the production felt the strange sensation of letting go, watching their work step into public space carried by invisible effort. The spend had not been large, but its rhythm had been flawless. Every signal reached its destination. After the release, when discussions began to circulate and reactions formed, the people who had managed the awareness phase could finally exhale. Their strategy of precision had paid off. The mood they had curated had taken hold. The film entered the world with the same control that had defined its making. Firm, deliberate, contained. There were no wild fluctuations, no noise to obscure the message. The awareness had grown like a pulse, steady and consistent, guiding the audience into the story's orbit. Looking back, what stands out is not the amount spent or the breadth of reach, but the cohesion of tone. The film had never pretended to be louder than it was, and that honesty became its strength. Every image released, every word spoken, reinforced the same emotional temperature. The awareness campaign, like the film itself, moved in precision rather than abundance. It trusted subtlety over saturation. The participants, now free from the pressure of concealment, could look at what had been achieved with quiet satisfaction. The spend had become invisible, transformed into atmosphere. The awareness didn't feel constructed. It felt inevitable. That seamlessness is the rarest form of success in this world. A campaign that disappears into the film it serves, leaving only the feeling it intended to evoke. In the end, the film's journey into public consciousness reflected its own essence. Understated, exacting, and sure of itself. Awareness was never forced. It unfolded. The audience didn't feel persuaded, they felt invited. That distinction made all the difference. The marketing had done what money alone cannot do. It created belief, and belief, once formed, spreads without further cost. The first weekend of a film's release is never just an event. It is a pulse check, a translation of months of invisible labor into public temperature. For those who had lived inside this one, the waiting was quiet but dense. They had carried the film through uncertainty, through borders and long nights, through the slow rhythm of building and finishing. Now the rhythm had shifted outside their control. The story belonged to strangers, and the numbers, though never spoken aloud, hung in the background like weather. What came in those first hours would not define everything, but it would color the days that followed. The atmosphere within the team that weekend was one of poised stillness. They had built a world of tension and precision, and now that same discipline held them steady as they waited for signs. The early hours after release felt disjointed. Calls, updates, murmurs from theaters, whispers about lines, reactions, moments of silence between data. Inside editing rooms turned makeshift offices. People listened for tone more than tally. Was the energy out there consistent with what they had built in here? The question lingered in every conversation. In those first screenings, something rare occurred. The audience fell silent. The film's pace, its focus, its sharpness, all the things that had defined its creation, translated into stillness in the room. Those who attended early showings didn't speak loudly afterward. They looked thoughtful, charged, reflective. For the filmmakers, hearing about that silence was a sign of arrival. The absence of noise became its own applause. There was no roaring euphoria, but there was weight, and weight is the truer signal of endurance. By the second day, the first waves of chatter began to ripple outward. The tone was cautious admiration. People spoke about intensity, clarity, craft. There was little mention of spectacle, only of rhythm and presence. Those who had carried the film felt relief in that alignment. The audience had understood. Awareness had done its work. The tone had reached its target. And yet, the mood inside the team did not swell into celebration. They had lived too long inside the quiet logic of restraint to abandon it now. They measured success not by noise but by steadiness. Behind closed doors, small meetings unfolded with the same controlled energy that had defined pre-production. The first signals were analyzed not for verdicts but for patterns. A steady start meant stability. A sudden spike meant volatility. The goal was neither explosion nor collapse but continuation. The people who had lived through the financing, the waiting, the calibration understood that what mattered most was trajectory, not debut. The film's heartbeat was strong. That was enough. As the weekend advanced, confidence took on new texture. It wasn't the loud kind, the press releases and victory statements, but a quiet current that ran through the team. Messages from friends, glimpses of audience reactions, brief reviews, all hinted that the film had found its space. Even in moments of critique, there was respect. The film's clarity was undeniable, its precision evident. Those who had built it recognized their work in the world's response. Few productions ever receive that exact reflection. Yet within the calm, there were moments of unease. Success always brings new pressure. Distributors whispered about expansion. Partners discussed pacing. The makers of the film, however, felt protective. They didn't want scale to distort tone. Their worry was not about growth but about balance. Would the film remain itself if carried too far too fast? They trusted that the same restraint that had guided creation would continue to guide release. The rhythm of awareness had proven effective. The rhythm of distribution now needed the same discipline. For many on the inside, that first weekend became a study in contrast, between exhaustion and curiosity, between closure and beginning. The days of controlled work had ended, yet the emotional energy persisted. Crew members who had not spoken in weeks reconnected through messages of shared relief. Editors, designers, and assistants who had once argued over seconds of footage now found themselves laughing over how those seconds were being praised by strangers. The film's release transformed private endurance into collective pride. In offices far from theaters, people who had handled the film's finances watched the signals with a different kind of satisfaction. They had tracked flow and timing for months. Now they saw return, not necessarily profit, but validation. The system had held. The careful pacing of resources had created something sustainable. The film was neither an underdog nor a runaway giant. It was balanced, consistent, true to its scale. That alignment between plan and outcome was rare, and everyone involved could feel it. Outside, the world kept talking. Conversations spread through audiences in cafes, online spaces, and quiet commutes. People debated motive, admired pacing, dissected moments of restraint. The film had entered public rhythm, and once that happens, it lives on its own. Those who made it could only watch as it drifted farther away, carried by currents of opinion they could not steer. For artists and producers alike, that distance felt both freeing and strange. The child they had raised so carefully was now walking alone. By the end of the weekend, a clear tone had emerged. The film had found its audience. Not everyone, but the right ones. The people drawn to its intensity, its realism, its emotional precision, responded with loyalty rather than volume. That pattern became the best kind of signal. Steady growth, sustained conversation, quiet respect. Within the industry, such signs meant endurance, not flash. For the filmmakers, it meant that the months of patience, of measured ambition, had paid off in resonance rather than spectacle. In the days that followed, reflections within the team deepened. What they remembered most wasn't the public reception but the shared sense of calm that replaced anxiety. The fear of rejection had dissolved into composure. They had learned to see the first weekend not as verdict but as mirror. It reflected the film's very nature. Steady, controlled, unhurried. The project had taught them that pace was everything. In storytelling, in financing, in release. The rhythm that had guided creation now guided response. The external world continued its cycle. New releases, shifting headlines. But for those inside, the experience lingered. They carried memories of that weekend as something almost private. They remembered where they were when the first call came, how silence felt before results arrived, how exhaustion gave way to relief. These were not moments of glory but of alignment. Times when the effort of months met the world's attention in harmony. When the next Monday arrived, the film had stabilized. The chaos of release had folded into routine. Reports became measured, updates less frequent. The mood across departments turned reflective. The film had made its mark not by breaking records but by confirming trust. That was its quiet victory. It justified every disciplined choice that had defined its creation. The balance between ambition and patience had been tested and had held. In the stillness that followed, the filmmakers felt something deeper than pride, a kind of closure that came from endurance. They had built something that stood on its own terms, weathered the scrutiny of its first weekend, and remained intact. The audience had felt what they wanted them to feel. The signals were clear, the verdict irrelevant. Success had arrived not as applause but as steadiness. And that steadiness, more than any number or headline, became the legacy of that first weekend. It was proof that a film could enter the world with grace, that quiet confidence could replace noise, that patience could outlast momentum. The film had not conquered, it had endured. And in the world of cinema, endurance is the truest form of triumph. The path a film takes once it leaves the theater is often invisible to those who first watched it flicker to life in darkened rooms. Yet this is where the story of its survival begins, the slow migration from the hands of its makers to the layered systems that carry it outward, where contracts become corridors and the work itself moves through unseen channels. For this one, the process unfolded like a relay. The film that began as an act of intimate creation was now an object of transaction, passing quietly between those who moved art and money with practiced coordination. Inside these layers, there was nothing dramatic, nothing hurried. The process was measured, procedural, built on understandings older than the film itself. Paper met signatures, receipts became records, and what had once been emotion and movement turned into scheduled deductions, calculated shares, and reconciled statements. Each exchange marked another step in the film's afterlife. It was no longer about whether the story moved people. It was about how it moved through systems designed to quantify its existence. Those who worked closest to these transitions felt a peculiar detachment. The world outside spoke in the language of reviews and acclaim, but inside, the focus had turned to structure, ensuring that each channel, each intermediary, functioned as expected. The process was not glamorous, but it was essential. Without it, the film could not continue its circulation, could not reach other markets, could not sustain its rhythm. The artistry had become inventory, and yet within that transformation there was a quiet respect. Everyone involved understood that these touch points, the paperwork, the reconciliations, were not enemies of art but protectors of its continuity. The ordinary frictions began to appear early. Approvals delayed, shipments rechecked, percentages recalculated. None of it was abnormal, and none of it unexpected. Those within the industry call this the drift, the natural slowing that follows the sprint of release. It's the period when everyone adjusts from adrenaline to administration, when energy shifts from creation to maintenance. The same patience that carried the film through production now had to sustain it through this quieter phase. Every step took longer than anyone wanted it to, but everyone knew that impatience had no value here. There were moments when the outward world's perception of success clashed with the reality inside the system. Articles praised the film's precision, its tone, its control, but behind the curtain, people were counting intervals, confirming payments, waiting for confirmations. These discrepancies never caused anger. They created perspective. The The makers of the film had learned by now that the public story of cinema and the private story of its journey rarely align. The world measures impact by visibility. The industry measures it by flow. The first deductions began soon after the release cycle stabilized. They came as small notices, fees, percentages, retentions. Each one chipped away at what once looked whole, transforming the grand narrative of success into the practical arithmetic of continuation. Those accustomed to the rhythm felt no disappointment. They had seen this pattern countless times. This was the cost of being seen, the toll paid at each gate of distribution. The process was less about losing than about redistributing, about ensuring that everyone who helped carry the story shared in its passage. For the creative team, these mechanisms were distant but understood. They had heard of them in abstract terms: back-end, share, recoupment, but few interacted with them directly. Their focus had always been on image, emotion, time. Yet even they could sense the shift. The long silences after release, the absence of urgency, the trickle of correspondence replacing the rush of production. All were signs that the film was now living through different hands. The art was still alive, but its heartbeat had changed frequency. They were not about wealth but about recognition, that the work had been seen, measured, valued. For those who had given more of themselves than they could quantify, these moments brought quiet balance. Not everyone waited in the same way. Some had direct stakes. Others waited through association, their link to the project emotional rather than contractual. Crew members who had long since moved to other productions still felt a faint attachment. They might hear that settlements were progressing or that accounts had cleared, and though it no longer affected them directly, the news stirred memory. Waiting, for them, had become nostalgia, a reminder of the long days and sharp focus that once defined their time. The culture of patience around the project was shaped by trust. From the beginning, the film had been built on measured belief. Faith that restraint could yield depth, that precision could sustain momentum. That same belief now guided its financial afterlife. Everyone involved knew that results came through order, not rush. The settlements arrived one by one, unannounced but inevitable. For the financiers, each clearance confirmed sound management. For the artists, it confirmed closure. For the coordinators in between, it confirmed function. The process carried a subtle emotional undertone. Money, though practical, represented acknowledgement. To see it finally return, even in small intervals, meant that what had once been effort had transformed into recognition. It wasn't about quantity. It was about completion. The production had required everyone to give without immediate return, to trust in something unfolding beyond their reach. The slow trickle of fulfillment became proof that such trust was justified. Those who had borne the largest weight of responsibility felt a different kind of relief. They had watched the film's entire journey, from idea to image, from image to object, from object to record. For them, these final weeks of reconciliation were less about gain and more about release. There was a sense of letting go, of stepping out from beneath a long shadow. Every confirmation, every notice, marked the closing of a loop that had begun years earlier. Their names now rested in the margins of a finished process. The language surrounding these final transactions was precise and unemotional, but those who read between the lines could sense warmth beneath formality. A line confirming completion meant gratitude. A signature meant trust upheld. A remittance meant promise kept. These gestures, though mechanical, carried the weight of memory. Behind each was a story of travel, fatigue, and faith. The people who now processed the film's accounts had once stood in cold streets adjusting lights or sat in dark rooms refining cuts. They understood what every document represented. There were delays, of course. There always are. But even those became part of the rhythm. When a document took longer than expected or an adjustment needed reissue, no one panicked. They had learned patience long ago. Waiting had become second nature, almost ritual. The film had taught them that time, when endured with calm, transforms uncertainty into confidence. So they waited, and the system caught up, as it always did. For those who had invested emotionally more than financially, the waiting was less about statements and more about closure. They wanted to know that what they built had found stability, that it had not disappeared into noise. When final acknowledgments arrived, through quiet messages, through updated ledgers, they felt a mix of melancholy and pride. The story they had lived was now complete, not only in art but in structure. By the end of this long aftermath, the atmosphere around the project had settled into stillness. All promises had found their places, all participants their acknowledgement. The film had moved from creation to circulation to settlement, completing its cycle. What began as motion had become reflection. The people who once worried about logistics now looked back with gratitude. They had seen how patience can become currency, how trust, maintained over time, transforms into shared peace. The film's participants would remember not the amounts or the schedules but the feeling of completion, the moment when waiting ended and everything aligned. They had learned something enduring, that in cinema, promises are not about gain but about closure, about returning balance to those who gave. The financial patience of this film mirrored its emotional one. Both were stories of endurance. Both carried quiet grace. In the end, the project stood as a testament to trust fulfilled. The people who had once worked in urgency now existed in calm, their efforts acknowledged, their commitments honored. The film had moved through its full cycle without disruption, and the patience that once seemed endless now felt like legacy. It had shown that the art of waiting, the willingness to trust that everything will arrive in its time, is not merely a financial virtue but a creative one. What remained, after all the waiting and reconciliation, was not fatigue but peace, and in that peace, everyone found the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. Relief, when it arrives in the financial life of a film, rarely bursts through the door. It seeps in quietly, unnoticed at first, like the easing of pressure after a long-held breath. For this one, that relief came not as a single event but as a gradual change of air. The people who had carried its weight through months of schedules and calculations began to feel it in the silence between updates, in the shrinking length of their to-do lists, in the way every remaining conversation started to sound more like reflection than resolution. The film's financial arc had been lived through tension and endurance. Now, what followed was stillness. The true cost of a production never reveals itself while work is happening. It hides behind motion, behind decisions made in haste, behind the need to keep everything moving forward. Only afterward, when the noise settles and the figures are reconciled, does the team begin to sense what was spent. Not in currency, but in energy, patience, and faith. The first glimmer of relief came when those invisible costs began to lighten. The emails grew fewer. The meetings shorter. The sense of constant vigilance eased into a quieter awareness. The storm of responsibility had passed, leaving the kind of calm that feels both earned and fragile. There was an odd serenity in this phase. No one expected surprises. The processes moved slowly, predictably. Statements arrived in intervals, always formal, never personal. Yet within that monotony, there was comfort. It meant that the machine was functioning, that the path remained open. The film was being processed, analyzed, delivered, its form flattened into reports and tallies, its memory encoded in ledgers. For those who understood the industry, this was not reduction but proof of endurance. To reach this stage meant survival. The contrast between public perception and internal reality deepened as time passed. To audiences, the film had already moved on. It existed now as a memory, a disc, a stream, a reference. But inside the ecosystem, it was still active, still crossing thresholds, still triggering calculations. Those working behind the scenes became stewards of its second life. They tracked rights, renewals, and royalties with quiet diligence, ensuring that each step aligned with the agreements made long ago. To them, the film was no longer a story but a series of obligations to be honored. And yet, beneath that procedural language, there lingered an affection, an understanding that these processes kept the story alive in their own way. Each time an adjustment was logged or a deduction reconciled, someone somewhere remembered the chaos of its creation. The cities crossed, the nights endured, the precision maintained. These memories softened the edges of bureaucracy. Paperwork was not cold when one had felt the heat of its origin. The people managing the film's financial circulation may not have been on set, but they became part of its continuation. They worked with the same quiet purpose as those who once adjusted lights or steadied cameras. Their art was accuracy. Their tool was time. The months following release carried a steady rhythm of closure. The film's movement through channels began to slow. Markets were cleared, statements aligned, and residuals distributed. The process felt less like a conclusion and more like the ebbing of a tide. The team members who still monitored its progress did so out of habit rather than necessity. They knew what the remaining steps would look like. There would be deductions that seemed small, others that stung slightly, but all predictable. The film had reached equilibrium, no longer expanding, no longer contracting, simply existing in continuity. Occasionally, a discrepancy would surface. A payment delayed, a figure disputed, a right contested. Such things were part of the landscape, resolved through correspondence that was courteous but deliberate. The tone remained professional, never emotional. The people involved had long since learned that calm was the only viable currency at this stage. There was no need for urgency. The system would balance itself eventually. The patience of production had transformed into the patience of reconciliation. By the time the final layers of deductions were settled, the film had become a pattern of numbers and acknowledgments. What had once been physical and immediate, faces, voices, motion, now lived as data archived in servers and accounts. Yet for those who had carried it, that transformation felt neither loss nor diminishment. It was the natural progression of a film's financial life. The transition from creation to circulation to memory. The art had been made, seen, paid for, and accounted. What remained was understanding. The calm acknowledgement that settled over the team in those later months felt earned. They had watched the film complete every cycle without disruption. The outward perception of success may have faded from headlines, but within their private awareness, the accomplishment was clear. The film had done what it needed to do. It had navigated the intricate ecosystem of distribution and deduction without fracture, without scandal, without loss of integrity. In the quiet of that realization, there was something resembling closure. The people who once tracked trucks and travel now tracked statements and clearances. The rhythm was different, but the meaning was the same. Continuity. The film's money path had become routine, which in this world is the highest form of peace. Stability, not spectacle, had become its legacy. And so, as the final reports were logged and archived, those still connected to it felt a quiet pride. They had not merely made a film, they had shepherded it through the invisible machinery that turns art into artifact. Each deduction, each confirmation, each slow acknowledgement was proof that it existed in both worlds, the creative and the procedural. The process had stripped away glamour but left truth. What began as movement and tension had ended as calm and order, the natural conclusion of a financial journey well lived. Every film carries within it a circle of promises, some spoken, some implied, all bound by the quiet expectation that effort will one day return as acknowledgement. For this one, those promises lingered like faint afterimages long after the cameras stopped rolling. They belonged to everyone who had carried the project forward. Financiers waiting for closure, crew members waiting for balance, artists waiting for recognition. The production had moved with such discipline that waiting had become part of its rhythm, a habit formed in months of patience and precision. Now, that same rhythm defined its aftermath. Those who had believed early found themselves watching the slow fulfillment of their trust. The film had reached completion, entered the world, and held steady within it. Yet the path between accomplishment and compensation was never direct. In cinema, arrival is not the end. It is the start of a quieter process. Statements, reconciliations, the gradual unspooling of acknowledgement. The participants who had lived through the fever of creation now lived through the calm of verification. The noise of production had given way to paperwork, the pace of art replaced by the pace of administration. Inside offices and inboxes, communication trickled at intervals. Updates, adjustments, confirmations. Each message carried the same tone: measured, procedural, polite. There was no drama, no urgency, only the slow satisfaction of knowing that everything was unfolding as it should. The people on the creative side, accustomed to motion and instinct, often felt detached from this rhythm. They had poured themselves into immediacy. Now they were learning endurance again. They had to trust that their contributions, once intangible, would soon become recognized within systems designed to move at the speed of caution. The sense of waiting was universal. Everyone waited differently. Some with curiosity, others with practiced patience. Producers monitored the flow of settlements, financiers looked for closure, actors received updates through representatives who translated progress into brief reassurances. The waiting was not frustration. It was continuity. Each person understood that this was how things worked. The film industry had its own tempo, one built on cycles rather than bursts. To have created something of substance meant living through its slow unfolding. Amid the stillness, there were occasional moments of communication that reminded everyone of connection. A message confirming completion of obligations. A small note of thanks. A document bearing signatures that marked an end to months of invisible effort. These small milestones carried disproportionate relief. They were not about wealth but about recognition, that the work had been seen, measured, valued. For those who had been closest to the budgeting, the transition felt physical. They could finally sleep through a night without waking to mental calculations, without rehearsing contingencies. The rhythm of daily tracking had slowed. Each new confirmation that accounts were clear felt less like a transaction and more like a breath of gratitude. They understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that the film had survived the labyrinth of its own making. Survival itself was the relief. On the creative side, the feeling took a different form. For months, the team had lived in a state of suspended responsibility, aware that every decision carried a price, that every moment of indulgence might echo down the chain of costs. Now, with everything reconciled, that awareness dissolved. The story was complete, the journey accounted for. They could think of their work again as art rather than arithmetic. That shift in perception was its own freedom. It allowed them to remember why they had begun in the first place. But relief, as it settled, brought understanding. The people who had endured the slow grind of paperwork and payments began to see the shape of the film's true cost. Not in the sense of loss, but in the realization that patience itself had been the greatest expense. Each delayed payment, each extended negotiation, had demanded composure. Every hour spent waiting for closure had required a kind of emotional capital that could never be quantified. Now that the waiting had ended, they felt not triumph but reconciliation. The cost had been absorbed, transformed into knowledge. There is a peculiar moment in the life of any production when help arrives too late to change anything but just in time to restore faith. For this film, that moment defined its later months. Small resolutions appeared one after another. Delayed funds cleared, pending obligations met, final approvals granted. Each of these moments might have been insignificant in isolation, but together they altered the atmosphere. The lingering anxiety that had clung to the team loosened. They no longer looked for what might go wrong. They began, tentatively, to trust that nothing would. That trust became a form of healing. Relief is not the absence of burden but the rediscovery of equilibrium. As balances settled, people rediscovered rhythm, days that no longer revolved around deadlines, conversations that returned to creativity. Departments that had once communicated only through spreadsheets now spoke of ideas again. The film had moved from being an obligation to being a memory, and in that transition, everyone involved regained something of themselves. For the producers, the sense of relief arrived last and deepest. They had been the custodians of every promise, the ones who had to translate creative urgency into financial possibility. Through all the stages, negotiations, compromises, reconciliations, they had carried a quiet dread that something might fall apart. When everything finally aligned, their relief was not joy but release. It was the quiet satisfaction of a structure that held, of faith rewarded by stability. They could finally step back and see the film not as a problem solved but as a whole piece of work that had justified every risk. Even as this calm took hold, the memory of tension remained. The team knew how fragile relief can be. They had lived long enough in uncertainty to treat calm as privilege. That knowledge lent the closure a particular grace. People spoke more softly, smiled more easily. The sense of having survived together replaced the weariness that had once defined them. They began to realize that the film's real cost was not measured in expenditure but in the endurance that had made its completion possible. The true payment had been time. Time given freely, stretched thin, reclaimed at the end as wisdom. The idea of cost changed for everyone who lived through that ending. What had once been counted in sums became something else entirely. The measure of trust required to sustain creation. Relief, when it came, was not the erasure of debt but the acknowledgement that every sacrifice had meaning. The late arriving stability gave shape to gratitude. The production had tested the limits of patience and proved that those limits were farther than anyone had imagined. When final reports were printed and archived, the sense of conclusion was accompanied by a strange quiet pride.